The Veridion Briefing.
Welcome to the Veridion Briefing. I am Sloan Mercer with the Veridion Group, a private intelligence and security consultancy. This is the Global Terrorism Situation Report for the week of March 27, 2026. The global warning picture this week is defined by concentration rather than uniform deterioration. That distinction matters. When everything is getting worse everywhere at the same rate, the decision challenge is about resource allocation across a broad front. When the pressure is concentrated in specific theaters and specific countries while others remain comparatively stable, the decision challenge is about prioritizing attention and action where the convergence of evidence is strongest. This week, that convergence is strongest in the Middle East and North Africa. It is the only theater on our global board where both of our proprietary analytical engines, the structural baseline and the live open source signal layer, are pointing in the same direction with meaningful force. That double convergence is what separates it from every other theater, several of which show strong structural pressure but lack the live corroboration that would push them into the highest priority band. Europe holds the second position, but with a critical caveat that will affect how you should respond. Latin America, led by Ecuador, and Sub-Saharan Africa, characterized by broad multi-country fragility, round out the priority review set. South Asia holds a guarded posture, and the remaining theaters are at watchlist level. Before I walk through each theater, I need to explain one analytical concept that is more important this week than in any previous briefing, because misunderstanding it will lead to the wrong decisions. Our structural baseline model measures whether a country's political violence activity level is likely to exceed that country's own historical high-stress threshold in the coming week. That is a powerful signal, but it measures operating environment stress, not terrorism specifically. A country like Iran can register the most extreme structural reading on the global board because its operating environment is generating political violence events at a rate far above its historical norm, even when that activity is driven by conventional warfare and state conflict rather than terrorism. A country like Ecuador can hold the highest exceedance probability of any country globally because of criminal and public order violence rather than terrorist operations. The structural model tells you where conditions are abnormally dangerous. The violence taxonomy tells you what kind of danger it is. You need both to make the right decisions. A corporate security director who reads a high structural number and assumes it means terrorism is making a category error that leads to the wrong response posture, and a risk manager who dismisses a high structural number because the violence is not terrorism is ignoring a real threat to their people and operations. Throughout this briefing, I will give you both the structural assessment and the violence classification for each theater so you can calibrate your response appropriately. Let me start with the theater that leads the global board. The Middle East and North Africa is the highest priority theater this week, and it earns that position through something no other theater achieves: convergence of both analytical engines pointing in the same direction with meaningful force. The structural picture is extreme. Iran's recent weekly event count exceeded its historical high-stress threshold by more than 100-fold. That is not a misstatement. Iran's baseline for political violence activity is historically very low, reflecting decades of suppressed reporting, and the current operating environment under active U.S.-Israeli military operations has produced event counts so far above that baseline that the ratio is in triple digits. Lebanon and Israel both show event counts that dwarf their historical norms by similarly extreme margins. These are not marginal exceedances. These are operating environments that are, by any historical standard, deeply abnormal. Several smaller Gulf states also appear in our structural monitoring picture. The United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman all register elevated readings. This requires careful interpretation. These countries have historically very low baselines for political violence, which means even modest recent activity registers as a significant relative departure from their historical norm. This does not mean these countries face imminent large-scale violence. It means their operating environments have shifted enough to warrant monitoring attention. Decision makers should interpret Gulf state readings as early indicators of environmental change rather than acute crisis signals. The live signal layer is where MENA distinguishes itself from every other theater. Our daily open-source intelligence monitoring has identified reporting during the current week that reinforces the structural picture rather than merely reflecting residual background noise. Iran-linked escalation dynamics and potential spillover discussion provide current week salience that supports maintaining a higher short-horizon review posture. The Tehran-Beirut-Tel Aviv-Baghdad arc represents the highest corridor-level pressure on the global board. However, not all narrative volume in the live layer should be treated as independent confirmation. Some portion inevitably reflects amplification of a narrower set of original reporting, which is why confidence is assessed at moderate rather than high despite the elevated probability band. This is an important discipline. The media volume coming out of the Middle East right now is enormous. But volume is not the same as independence. 10 outlets reporting the same wire story is one source, not 10. We discount for amplification, and that discounting is reflected in the confidence level. The fused analytical likelihood for MENA is assessed at approximately 82%, placing it in the high band. The violence classification is hybrid mixed environment, meaning terrorism, proxy operations, and state conflict are all present and cannot be cleanly separated. The decision support recommendation is review now across all time horizons, with board-level briefing recommended for organizations with material Middle Eastern exposure. The regime shift trigger state is executive escalation, the highest category on our board. This is the only theater receiving that designation. If you have personnel, assets, routing, or contractual exposure in Iran, Lebanon, Israel, or Gulf transit corridors, immediate review within 72 hours is warranted. This is not a spike and fade theater. Both the 7-day and 30-day outlooks remain elevated. Europe holds the second position, and I need to explain why its inclusion requires a different response than the Middle East. Ukraine's structural pressure is extreme. Its recent weekly political violence event count was nearly double its own historical high-stress threshold. Russia adds further structural weight. Together, these two countries account for the vast majority of Europe's warning relevance. Secondary European countries including France, Serbia, Hungary, Germany, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Greece all register materially lower structural readings. France shows the highest secondary reading, but still at a level reflecting monitoring attention rather than acute concern. The critical analytical point is that the violence taxonomy in Europe is overwhelmingly state-on-state and proxy conflict, not terrorism-dominant activity. The live signal layer confirms that the operating environment remains severe but does not provide evidence that would justify shifting the theater's taxonomy to a terrorism-dominant framing. This distinction is essential for decision-makers. Europe demands attention for continuity planning, travel risk management, routing decisions, and cross-border exposure assessment. But framing the European theater as a terrorism escalation environment without country-by-country supporting evidence would be analytically unsound. The language you use in internal communications matters. If you tell your board that Europe faces terrorism escalation, you are making a claim the evidence does not support. If you tell them Europe faces severe operating environment disruption from conventional conflict with potential spillover implications, you are making a claim the evidence strongly supports. The fused analytical likelihood for Europe is assessed at approximately 74%, placing it in the moderate-high band. The violence classification is state or proxy conflict. The decision support recommendation is review now at the 72-hour horizon for organizations with Ukraine, Russia, or Eastern European logistics exposure, with an emphasis on continuity planning rather than terrorism-specific posture changes. The scenario that would change Europe's classification is a discrete lone actor or networked terrorist plot in a Western European capital. The current evidence does not justify pushing that forecast materially higher, but historical precedent for conflict zone spillover into Western Europe means it cannot be dismissed. France and Serbia show non-trivial model readings that warrant continued monitoring. Latin America's priority status this week is driven by a single country, and it is a country that has been climbing our structural rankings for months. Ecuador holds the highest exceedance probability of any country in the entire global dataset. Its recent weekly event count exceeded its historical high-stress threshold, and our proprietary model assigns it the maximum possible structural exceedance probability. When a country hits 1.0 in our model, it means the system assesses with near certainty that conditions will exceed the historical high-stress norm. Ecuador is the only country globally at that level this week. This is not a new development. Our audiences who follow the Veridion Briefing have heard us discuss Ecuador's deterioration for months. The country that was one of South America's safest nations less than a decade ago is now generating structural pressure readings that exceed every other country on the planet. The violence is primarily criminal and public order in nature, driven by cartel fragmentation, extortion expansion, and the consequences of the kingpin strategy approach to organized crime. But the operating environment it creates is genuinely dangerous for anyone with exposure in the country. Colombia provides secondary support with an elevated exceedance probability, indicating that the analytical system is responding to temporal patterns and trajectory features, not just raw event counts. The remainder of the theater sits at materially lower structural levels. The live signal layer in Latin America is weaker than in the Middle East. Available open-source reporting neither strongly amplifies nor negates the structural picture. This means the theater's priority status rests primarily on the strength of the structural signal rather than on multi-layer convergence. Confidence is therefore somewhat lower than probability. We are fairly certain the structural pressure is real. We are less certain about the short horizon trajectory because the live layer does not provide strong directional guidance. The fused analytical likelihood for Latin America is assessed at approximately 61%, placing it in the moderate-high band. The violence classification is hybrid mixed environment. Ecuador-linked exposure warrants immediate review. Colombia warrants a prepare posture. The remainder of the theater warrants watchlist monitoring only. Sub-Saharan Africa presents a fundamentally different pattern from the other priority theaters, and understanding that difference matters for how you respond. Where the Middle East is concentrated in a few countries at extreme levels and Latin America is concentrated in one country at maximum structural pressure, Sub-Saharan Africa is broad. Nigeria and Somalia are the clearest structural stress cases, both registering recent weekly event counts above their historical high-stress thresholds. Burkina Faso and Ethiopia sit near their respective thresholds. Cameroon, Mali, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic add further breadth. The violence taxonomy across the theater is a hybrid mixed environment, encompassing terrorism, insurgency, and political violence in overlapping and often inseparable patterns. The challenge with Sub-Saharan Africa is that the live signal layer is thinner here than in the Middle East. The structural picture is clear enough to compel review, but the live layer does not provide the corroborative depth needed for aggressive upward updating. This means the theater sits in a zone where structural evidence says pay attention, but live evidence says we cannot tell you exactly what happens next with high conviction. Thin live coverage should be interpreted as lower certainty, not as lower threat. The absence of corroborating reporting from a region with limited media infrastructure does not mean the absence of danger. The fused analytical likelihood for Sub-Saharan Africa is assessed at approximately 55%, placing it in the moderate band. Nigeria and Somalia warrant selected 72-hour monitoring. The broader theater warrants 7-day active review. Corridor, route, and secondary city posture reviews are more useful here than broad theater alarm. The 30-day outlook suggests persistent rather than spike and fade relevance. The indicator that would quickly elevate this theater is concentrated live acceleration in Nigeria or Somalia. If corroborated reporting of major jihadist operations emerges from either corridor, the theater moves into a higher review band immediately. South Asia is guarded, not calm, but not competing for executive attention at the same level as the four leading theaters. The warning picture is driven almost entirely by Pakistan, which sits above its historical high-stress threshold with a structural exceedance probability of approximately 65%. Pakistan recorded 103 political violence events in the observed period, substantially above its historical norm. India, by contrast, remains well below its own threshold with a very low exceedance probability. The remaining South Asian countries are materially lower still. This lack of cross-country alignment is what separates South Asia from the leading theaters. Pakistan alone is sufficient to prevent complacency. It is a country with a complex threat environment, active insurgent and terrorist organizations, and a structural signal that demands monitoring. But one elevated country does not produce the same theater-level urgency as multiple simultaneously stressed countries. The fused analytical likelihood for South Asia is assessed at approximately 49%, placing it at the moderate level. Pakistan-linked exposure warrants a prepare posture with selected monitoring. The indicator that would change this assessment is corroborated live escalation in Pakistan concentrated in urban centers or border zones, or any indication that India is beginning to trend upward toward its own threshold. The three remaining theaters are at lower priority levels. East Asia and the Pacific is assessed at approximately 38% likelihood in the low-moderate band. Myanmar carries the highest absolute burden of political violence, but sits below its own extreme historical baseline. Indonesia shows a modest reading. The theater does not generate the structural pressure or live corroboration to compete with the leading four theaters. Myanmar-linked exposure warrants a prepare posture. The remainder of the theater is watch list only. Russia and Eurasia outside the European conflict zone is assessed at approximately 31% in the low band. Kazakhstan leads the sub-regional picture with a modest reading. Afghanistan, despite its well-known security environment, registers a low structural probability because its recent activity sits below its own very high historical baseline. This is counterintuitive, but analytically sound. The model measures departure from historical norms, not absolute danger. Afghanistan's historically extreme baseline means recent activity must be exceptionally high to trigger an exceedance flag. The theater is at watchlist monitoring level. North America is assessed at approximately 24% in the low band. Structural pressure is limited across the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Mexico is the primary watch country but remains below its own historical threshold. The violence taxonomy is organized criminal violence mixed with political violence at the monitoring level. This is not assessed as a terrorism-dominant environment. Watchlist monitoring only. Now let me present 4 competing scenarios for how the global picture could evolve over the next 7 to 30 days. Scenario A is sustained MENA escalation, assessed at 45 to 55% probability. This is the baseline expectation. Under this scenario, structural pressure in the Middle East persists or intensifies, Iran-linked activity remains elevated, Lebanon and Israel continue to exceed their thresholds, and live reporting continues to reinforce the structural picture. This scenario would be reinforced by any broadening of live corroboration into Gulf states or by verified cross-border operational planning. It would be weakened by a sharp structural decline in Iran coupled with reduced live signal salience. Scenario B is European spillover shift, assessed at 15 to 25%. Under this scenario, the violence environment in Europe begins to generate terrorism-relevant spillover beyond the Ukraine-Russia conflict zone. This could manifest as retaliatory attacks in Western European capitals, radicalization-driven lone actor events linked to conflict narratives, or proxy-facilitated disruption targeting critical infrastructure. France and Serbia show non-trivial model readings. Historical precedent for conflict zone spillover into Western Europe means this scenario cannot be dismissed even though the current evidence does not justify pushing it higher. Scenario C is Latin American broadening, assessed at 20 to 30%. Under this scenario, political violence pressure broadens beyond Ecuador to include sustained escalation in Colombia and potentially Honduras or other Central American corridors. This would shift the theater from a single country-driven warning to a regional pattern requiring broader executive attention. Colombia is the most likely broadening candidate, but the live signal does not yet confirm this trajectory. Scenario D is global deceleration, assessed at 10 to 15%. Under this scenario, structural pressure across all leading theaters recedes within the next 2 to 3 weeks through political de-escalation, ceasefire developments, or seasonal patterns. This is the least probable scenario given current evidence. Multiple theaters are simultaneously showing elevated or extreme structural readings, and the live layer has not signaled theater-wide cooling in any priority region. This scenario would require observable deceleration across at least 3 of the 4 leading theaters simultaneously. Let me address the gaps in our knowledge because they directly constrain the confidence levels in everything I have told you. The most significant gap is not structural baseline coverage. It is theater-balanced live corroboration. The live signal layer is most robust in the Middle East and materially thinner in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, East Asia, Russia, Eurasia, and North America. This unevenness means confidence in aggressive short-horizon updating outside the Middle East is constrained. When I tell you SSA is at 55% with moderate low to moderate confidence, the lower confidence reflects the thin live picture, not lower structural concern. Source independence depth in live reporting is the second gap. We cannot fully demonstrate outlet-by-outlet source independence at full theater scale from the available weekly corpus. This is why MENA's confidence is moderate rather than high despite the highest probability band on the board. We cannot rule out that a portion of live reporting reflects amplification rather than independent confirmation. Terrorism-specific attribution in mixed environments remains a persistent gap across MENA, SSA, Latin America, and South Asia. The structural baseline does not resolve violence categories. Attribution requires incident-level analysis that goes beyond the scope of a weekly operating environment product, and city-level resolution is a gap. This product operates at the country level. Corridor and city-tier language in our decision support sections is qualitative and exposure-oriented, not derived from a separate subnational model. Here are the watchlist tiers for executive review and monitoring resource allocation. Critical tier, warranting immediate review, Iran and Ecuador. Elevated tier, warranting active preparation, Ukraine, Lebanon, Israel, and Pakistan. Guarded tier, warranting enhanced monitoring, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Somalia, and Colombia. Watch tier, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Mali, Mexico, Myanmar, and Kazakhstan. The key takeaway for this week is this: concentration is the story. The pressure is not uniform. It is clustered in specific theaters and specific countries where structural evidence and, in the case of the Middle East, live corroboration converge. The Middle East is the only theater where both analytical engines are aligned with meaningful force. Ecuador is the single most structurally elevated country on the planet. Sub-Saharan Africa's breadth demands persistent attention even without a single focal trigger. And the rest of the map, while not generating the same urgency, continues to require calibrated monitoring because the scenarios that would change the picture, European spillover, Latin American broadening, South Asian escalation, are all plausible even if not currently the dominant pathway. The organizations that succeed in this environment are the ones that understand concentration and respond to it with discipline rather than either spreading resources uniformly across all theaters or ignoring everything except the loudest headline. Match your response posture to the evidence. Prioritize where convergence is strongest. Monitor where structural pressure is present, but live confirmation is thin. And maintain the analytical discipline to distinguish between operating environment violence and terrorism attribution, because the right diagnosis determines the right response. That is the Veridion Briefing for this week. The full analytical product with complete sourcing, probability assessments, severity indicators, alternative scenarios, intelligence gaps, and all supporting analysis is available to subscribers. If your organization operates internationally and you need to understand what this means for your specific exposure, visit veridiongroup.com/briefing to schedule a consultation with our analysts. I am Sloan Mercer with the Veridion Group. Stay informed, stay prepared. I will see you next week.